Thank you very much. It's great to be here today. Thank you very much. And thanks to Celeste and everybody for putting this together. It's a great discussion and it comes at an important time. Like Jim, I speak to you today with some degree of trepidation because as a communicator, what I do for a living is I take stories that those of you in this room have and help get that message out. So today, instead of speaking at you, I really wish that I was listening and hearing from you. Because, and if we could go to the next slide, please. In this room, about the 100 people that are in here, I would say that all of you have one, if not 10 different stories about why this current system is broken and why it needs to why it needs to be solved. And I think that, as Jim mentioned, and I think there's the question in the audience in the back came sort of this litigation versus the congressional, congressional fix. The only way public officials make change is if there's a broad understanding of what the problem is. And I think that the best way to illustrate what a problem is through personal stories. So I think today what we're going to talk about, and we're going to talk about getting your stories out, and whether that's a one-on-one communication to your neighbor or the person sitting next to you, whether it's in small groups or whether it's through the masses of the folks around the country. Because as was said multiple times in the previous discussion, and what we're going to touch on today is those of us that live east of the Mississippi have no idea what you all are living here through, and unless that changes, I would argue that so too policy from Washington won't change either. So we have a lot of work to do, but I would say that, and Vic teed up today in a great way by talking about sort of the numbers of the Constitution in Greece. I think that it's definitely possible, and frankly, we're in the midst of social change that we've seen and read about it on a daily basis that started in rooms like this. So I'm very optimistic that with the stories that you all have to tell, change can in fact happen. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this slide looks familiar. We did not coordinate on presentations. But again, as those of us that grew up in the East Coast, it's shocking, right? But this is so true for the reporters, from the lawmakers, from the sort of the stakeholders, from everybody that lives outside of this region. It's eye-opening. Now, how do you put a picture into 1,000 words? And I think that that's the challenge that all of us have in front of us. So if you can go to the next slide, please. But with that, we have some myth busting and some public education to do. One of the things that, when you take somebody who doesn't know your issues, right, is they hear certain words and they reach certain conclusions. And by the way, I would say that some of this is not ill intent, it's uninformed, right? So I think we can sometimes separate out, and by the way, there are people with agendas, and we'll talk about that too, but a lot of what we think from communications perspective is we're talking with people that just don't know. So I would say, and again, this is my take, right? Feel free to keep me honest and correct me here, but I think a lot of times the term rancher will get thrown out, and the conception is vast pieces of land, but people need to understand, right, that one must lease to graze and care about that. They have to. There's work associated with that obligation, and it's not vast pieces of land. Federally owned lands, a lot of times, and I think we've seen this too, and by the way, we've seen this from the opposition, they love to say that they love to equate federally owned with public. And the truth of the matter is, as you all know far better than I will ever do, public access is not always the priority in that context. Again, and this is myth busting that needs to get done. And I think the last thing is, and frankly, the last conversation, the last discussion teed this up very well, is that when we say states could do a better job, I think a lot of times automatically folks will reach to the conclusion that states will mismanage. And the truth of the matter is, and we're going to talk a lot about the central message today, if people don't understand that federal management is falling short on multiple fronts, right, they won't then accept that more power needs to devolve back to states and ranchers. So I think that's a really important thing. We need to illustrate the problem. And again, the stories that you all have to tell are the best argument for why change needs to happen. So we can go to the next slide, please. Can I just ask for a show of hands, who likes the media? I figured that was going to be the case. But here's the truth. The media are a really important vehicle to tell one story. And I will say that some of the issues that we're seeing transpiring now on the sort of the front pages of newspapers are issues that got driven to public attention through media, right? So, and by the way, I have a shared experience with media. I'm a Republican. I've done Republican politics, and let me tell you, I can count on one hand the number of fair shots I've gotten from reporters, but that doesn't mean that we don't engage with them, because they're a very, very important tool to get one's message out. And the good news here is back in a day where, not that long ago, we had basically a very controlled media environment where we had a couple networks and a couple national newspapers and then some local newspapers. If we could flip to the next slide, please. We can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Today, there's never been a more favorable media environment for us getting our story out, right? It's everywhere. And it's not just media. It's social. It's letters to the editor. It's talk radio. So one of the things we're going to also talk about again is how do we capitalize on this new fractured media environment to sometimes find more favorable outlets for us, but make sure that we're capitalizing on all the channels available to us to get our story out. We can go to the next slide, please. I'll also say, and we talked about this over breakfast, one of the things, and I think the lessons, and I don't know exactly who's in the room, but I'm going to talk bad at them in case they're here. They can offend me afterwards. The environmentalist movement has done this to a T. They use media in a sort of vicious cycle to raise awareness of an issue, to raise money, to activate their supporters, to influence lawmakers, and it goes round and around and around again. They do this so well on every issue, and I work on a lot of these issues with corporate clients and industry associations. I'm suggesting that we need to take a page from their playbook, because this is the only way that change happens, right? And it's not just media, by the way. We're going to focus a little bit on other communications, but I think one of the points that I really want to leave us with today is the media is a tool, and we need to use it to our advantage. Next slide, please. And by using that tool, we're actually able to connect to where Americans already are on issues. I mean, you all are experiencing frankly, a federal government that's completely gone well beyond its charter. The good news here is that the American public agrees with you on fundamental issues. The trust in federal government's at an all-time low. People don't believe that the federal government does anything well. I mean, only 19%, and by the way, I would love to meet those 19% of Americans who believe that the feds do the right thing some or all the time, right? So the truth of the matter here is that this is, by using communications, we're able to go to where the audience that we want to reach already are, and I think we have an opportunity of doing that. I would say, too, that a lot of times, especially in this current political cycle, a lot of it's characterized as anger, and I think what we're really talking about here is frustration, and I think there's a difference, right? So to the degree that, and by the way, I'm sure there's a lot of anger around the country on a lot of different issues, but to the degree that we're positioning these as frustrations, I think that the American public view them as frustration, because they're equally frustrated too, even if they're not angry. So to the degree that we could be on a level playing field on some of those issues, it's good. The one note I'll also say, though, as we're talking about how the public views issues, and I think that this is very important for our discussion today, is the only difference in terms of how Americans view the federal government is one on the environment, where there's actually this notion that somehow the federal government could do a better job than the private sector or individuals on environmental stewardship. The reason why that's important, and we're going to tie back to that in a second, if we can go to the next message, is that that's really a part of what the story that you all need to be telling is, right? I would offer that we cannot cede that ground, right? And I'm not suggesting we are, but it's a really important part of the story. So in terms of the story we tell, and again, I think it comes down to 4 basic buckets. One, it's the roots of what you do and the value you provide for the land, for the environment, for our economy, down the line. 2, I think that it's really important that those of you in this room, represent decades and generations of folks that have managed the land. And I think that those roots are a very important part of the story. 3rd, again, back to the roots of your frustration. It's the personal stories, right? What got you to this point and what's your personal experience? And we're going to talk about that in a second. And then I think that then through those 3 lenses, we're able to talk about the root of your frustration, which is the federal land management. Next slide, please. There's other message elements, too, that I think that looking at a lot of things often don't break through. I mean, whether it's the contributions to the tax base, I think we talked about environmental stewardship, but also the strong rural communities. Again, these are all things that I think they're attributes that need to get assigned to ranching in a much clearer way, right? Because again, these are things that I think if we were to look at Congress, and I think we had a very interesting conversation today about how little members of Congress know about some of these issues, if you're not representing these areas, these are all attributes that I think that every elected official from local down to federal need to understand, right? And I think that that's part of the challenge we have. So next slide. So how do we do all that? Well, I think, again, these are 2, and we're not going to look at the actual text on these slides. And there's some really good personal stories on publiclandscouncil.org, by the way, if you haven't seen the website. But these are exactly the kinds of snapshots that we need to be, taking to the market. They're very, very important. They're personal. One of the things, and just as an aside, but it'll get right back to this, is there was it turns out that the researchers for the university fabricated some of the data. So that's never good when you're promoting a research paper. But they were doing door-to-door, and some of you may have seen this. This was a political science survey where they were going door-to-door on things like gay marriage. And they showed through the research that people had a different point of view on something like gay marriage and abortion when they're talking to an individual one-on-one at the door. So it's one thing to have a conversation about something that's abstract, but when you're standing in front of somebody and saying, I am a gay American, right, or something. I mean, the good news is Americans are wholeheartedly good people, so I think that it's, but my tangent gets back to this point, which is we have to tell our own stories and we have to show ourselves through our stories, because I think that a lot of times our issues are being looked at in a very abstract way, right? So assigning names, faces, personal stories will never, it cannot get used enough. So I think and research shows that this is an effective way of communicating. If we could go to the next slide, this is another example. So I think that how do we do all that? Next slide, please. Well, so whether you're talking to a reporter, a lawmaker, or your neighbor, now we're going to kind of get into sort of rules of the road in terms of communications. There's really 4, and I don't know why, but everything always starts with the same letter, and in this case it's C's. But the keys to communication success are confidence, right? Blind flash of the obvious. Control. What control is important here, and I think a lot of times, whether it's a reporter or your neighbor, is we forget that in communications we get to actually control the conversation, right? Colin Powell had this famous quote about the media gets to ask the questions, but I get to control the answers. Well, it's true, right? So when we are talking to people, we get to sort of set the tones of the dialogue and the debate. And I think control is something that we can't lose sight of. It's really important for communications. Credibility, obviously, and then connection. And I think that through the stories that we talked about, the credibility and the connection will be illustrated. So these are hallmarks of effective communication. Next slide, please. And our audiences, again, whether it's a reporter who, and I cannot make a bigger point of this, reporters are not an audience, they're a channel to the audience, right? So when a reporter is doing a story, the one that I think a lot of times, and frankly I've fallen victim of this many times, is you get into the trap of talking to the person, you're not talking to who they reach. What reporters are looking for and others, they want perspective, relevance, and authenticity. But the same is true when you're thinking about who's going to read that newspaper article, hear that story, hear that interview on talk radio, see the letter to the editor. So it's really important, I think, to be thinking about the audience you're trying to reach. Next slide, please. So some things to think about and to sort of prep for, and again, whether this is any conversation, and this is not just media, why am I having this conversation, right? What do you want to get out of it? A lot of times that could be as simple as I want them to understand my perspective, or I want to be able to talk about what I want to have fixed. Who am I trying to reach? Again, so that's especially, think about the end audience. And a lot of times the end audience is not the person that one is speaking to. What's your goal, obviously? And in the message perspective, messaging and storytelling are interchangeable. So I think this, so a lot of times we talk about message, and by the way, there's a lot from talking points memos and everything else. I mean, what we're talking about is stories, right? So, but it's very important for the story, for preparation to go into what you want to advance to a certain audience. Next slide, please. The other things, too, about these dialogues, and again, this is applying to a media member, a legislative staff, listening is very important. And it's important to listen to, because I think it's amazing how much you could react to someone when you're listening carefully. Pausing before answering is some of the media's best tricks are to get you to keep on talking and to not give a natural pause. Supporting your messages with personal stories and anecdotes. as we talked about earlier, setting the record straight is probably the most important thing on this slide. To the degree that anybody has inaccuracies or misperceptions or things that they just get wrong or are not aware of, I think it's our job, and by the way, we would do this in our kitchen room table, we would do it outside in our front yard, we would do it to, at wherever. If somebody has something wrong, whether it's a reporter or a lawmaker or somebody, I think we have an obligation to set the record straight, and that's a really important thing. And I think the last thing, and I'm probably not doing a very good job at it today, but when you make your point, stop talking. And I think that especially from a media perspective, again, a reporter's favorite tactic is to just get you to keep on going and going. And that's first off, you lose all ability for message control. And secondly, if you've made your point, you've made your point, right? So next slide. And don'ts. Interrupt. Sometimes, again, back to the listening thing, I think it stands to reason, but even if somebody says something that's very inaccurate, you have the opportunity of listening to it in its entirety and then taking on. Repeating a negative, I think, is the one that I would put on this slide. It's the famous Dick Nixon, "I'm not a crook," quote, right? I mean, it's something that we do all the time, and I would suggest that actively listening for things and training yourself to not repeat negatives is really, really important. And then I think that the last thing, and this is important too, especially just in general life, don't say anything you don't want attributed to you. And I think that this is really important, in terms of how we communicate, especially now with a world of social media and phones that are able to record every moment. It's just really important to be very controlled in terms of what we say to who, to make sure that that is not either taken out of context, right, or going into places where we can't control. So next slide, please. So one of the things in the back of the room that, and I know we focused a lot on media today, but if we accept the premise that for change to happen, we need to build a movement and we need to get out there with our message. The packets that Celeste and the team prepared has some really valuable resources that I think that allow us and you all to get your story out. Letters to the editor are tremendously helpful, right? And frankly, there's a guidebook in that takeaway that sort of talks about some ways of writing a letter to the editor. We're talking about 60, 70 word pieces, right? But they're very, very important. So too are talk radio. And by the way, there's resources in that book that allows you to find the contact information for your local newspaper. The same thing too with talk radio. Really, really important to get a message out. Emails, I've worked on campaigns where it was a neighborhood group or a list of friends, right, and emails, but constantly sort of updating people about issues and about challenges and about perspectives. How many of you are on social media? It's a great tool. I mean, it's a great tool. And sometimes with social media, you end up talking to one another, but by the way, that's really good, right? You need to sometimes talk to one another. So I would say social media is fantastic. For those of you that are not on it, you're not missing much. But it's a really, really important tool to stay tuned to what the conversations are going. And again, as I think of all of us that have social feeds, it's a way of keeping people that actively engaged. Lawmaker visits. I mean, obviously I know we have, staff in the room. We have got some elected officials. From a political background, I think those conversations can't happen enough, especially when we're trying to keep issues and the problems front and center with these folks. And then community engagement, meetings like this, things back home, it's vitally important. So the next slide, to close, and I hope this was helpful. I think 3 main points. One is your story is your story. You have to share it, right? I mean, if change is ever going to happen, conversations like this summit are going to be part of the equation, but we need to think outside this room and we need to get a bigger megaphone. We've seen examples where, frankly, others, including our opposition, from environmental movements, do this. They adopt it. We need to do the same. It's really important. 2 is your reality is often distorted. Let's fix it, right? We have the ability to do it. We've got the messages. You've got the personal stories. I think it takes each and every one of us, both as individuals but collectively, but we've got to do it. And 3, the media is not to be feared. It's a channel. Let's use it. Let's use the hell out of it, right? Because unless we actually start getting our side of the story out through media coverage, those of us that are in Washington or New York or others are not going to get the issue. We're not going to get the situation. It's just too hard to tell. So change is going to come from conversations like this, and I think the media is an important part of that equation. So with that, thank you very much.
My concern is trying to get your story out to the news media, and they won't put it on.
So the question is, or the comment is, concern about getting your comments to the media and them not putting it on the air. So that's why I think self-publishing is even more important. So letters to the editor, talk radio, the social media aspect. That's the change of this new media environment is all of us actually have megaphones now in a way that we didn't have. You're completely right, and by the way, that's a real frustration for all of us. And sometimes when the reporters want to do our story, we don't want them to tell our story because they may have, but I think that's why we have to fill the gaps with the other communications. I think that the routine, and again, I know that we have multiple states represented in this room, but to the degree that every newspaper, and some of them are online. One of the fastest growing newspapers are some of the online local portals around the country. They're actually increasing in circulation while everybody's down. They all allow for letters to the editor, op-eds, commentaries. So I would say that we have to expand the media universe a little bit and stay at it, but I think you make a really good point. In the back.
Yeah, I just was going to ask if you could go to that slide that had
the circle?
Yeah.
Sure. Can we go back? I think it's slide. Yeah, it's toward the beginning. Keep going. A couple more. That's one. Yeah. Was there a thought or a question on this, or?
I just wanted a copy of it.
Okay. And the slides will be available through Celeste. Again, I think that just to put a point on the obvious, this is the chain, and I think that this is a really important rationale for why media need to be used the way that they are. Go ahead.
So, when you do letters to the editor, or you do articles, press releases, and so forth, we can do that, but how do we get to the Associated Press that goes everywhere? Because I play in the wild horse world, okay? So, we put something out there and it lands in one paper.
Yeah.
But how do they get it to go to the Associated Press so they all can? How do we get that done?
It's a great question. So I'm going to be blunt. That's hard, but because, again, conversations like this are bottom up, right? And AP likes top down. So they need an association, an organization to talk to AP for stories that feed a bunch of different newspapers. Ideally, both of them fit together. So let's dissect the two. So yes, do the letters to the editor local paper. I think one of the things about, and I hope that's addressed at some point, is the decentralization of all of us in this room prevents things like AP and things from happening, right? So I would say that, and I think that movements start with volunteers and people saying, I will be that person. But I think that, if I were to prescribe activities, it's that small groups of you should be talking to the AP reporters that cover not only the states and the regions, not only from an education perspective, but in the hopes that you're driving stories that then sort of translate through the country. An op-ed or letter to the editor won't do it. It's news coverage that would. But I would say, though, that op-eds and sort of short commentary pieces could be the sort of the happy medium where you have, and by the way, we've seen this a lot where there is a news service called Medium. And if you want to look at it, it's an online op-ed self-publishing service. It was founded by one of the people who did, I think it was YouTube. All it is folks like all of us basically post a piece, and people are able to read other people's pieces, and then they start getting, based on the number of eyeballs, they start rising within the service. I've seen articles, especially in this election cycle, written by individuals on like Donald Trump that get repurposed in a national review. So publications are looking at some of these to say, wow, this is a really interesting thing. Let me go talk to her or him about this topic. So I think that there's a lot of channels that are new beyond the AP. that allow for that self-publishing, and then you use social media and other forms of communications to get that message out.
What was the name of that?
Medium. Medium. It's a fantastic, and it's relatively new, but LinkedIn, are you all on LinkedIn? That's another one where I think LinkedIn used to be used for jobs, right? It allows you to sort of see, who's doing what. Well, now you could actually self-publish in LinkedIn, and you're able to reach audiences in a much more targeted way than you ever would with other forms of communications. I mean, Twitter, I'm not on Twitter, by the way. I think Twitter is the death of America, but I'm sorry, that was my own commentary. No, I'm sorry, I'm kidding. The thing with Twitter is it's not controlled, right? Anybody could follow one another. There's a lot of noise. The nice thing about LinkedIn is you already have a network of people. A lot of times it's folks just like yourself, right, who are able to see your perspective. So the quality of audience is much better sometimes than the quantity, and that's the kinds of things that we need sometimes. Look, bottom line, and I'm sorry to go on a tangent, but sometimes we have to shore one another up too, right? So it's the AP, but it's also making sure that one of us are seeing our own message across the board, because I think the best way of one of us stepping out is when you see somebody else having done it, and you're like, okay, I'm going to do this now too. So, in the back.
So a lot of these issues have been around for a long time, and going back to that frustration, do you have any tips on how to keep our community engaged so that we can get them to write letters and stuff? Because just, a lot of people say it doesn't do any good, and of course, that's not true, but I would just love your thoughts on that.
Question is how else to keep the community and others engaged. I think actually the resources that are in the back of the room are ones that I would actually be giving to people as you're out there. Say, look, if I'm writing letters to the editor, I need you to do the same thing. Wouldn't it be great if you call, let's think about this as a multiplying force, right? So the things that we're talking about today, we should be actively encouraging others to do too. So every conversation, you're going to that conversation with an ask. And the ask are that they take the same message in the same vehicles and they tell their story again. Because that's exactly what the other side does, right? So I think that that's really, really important.
My question was just with the shift in generational shift and also the urban and rural that we spoke about, how are people getting their news? What are the studies showing from your perspective? I think things have changed a lot in recent years where people are no longer reading print newspapers or sources like that. Is it social media? Is it a variety? I mean, where are the new people getting their news?
It's a great question. So actually, I think local media has actually increased in importance, because the one thing that the blogs and the national media or whatever you're reading online doesn't do is it doesn't give you the sports and it doesn't give you the weather, right? So one of the things we find is that local media is still doing quite well, especially on the broadcast side. To talk radio, it's funny because radio is our first form of mass communication, right? Outside of printed materials and early newspapers, it's also become the most important, especially for issues like the ones we're talking about, right? So I think that's important. I think the one thing, and actually I would argue that this is not a bad thing, so if we think about where we are today versus where we want to be, talking to people that agree with us is not a bad thing to do. And talk radio, the way that we process media is a lot of times people go to media sources that they agree with and they like, right? So they're not reading the Huffington Post or the New York Times editorial page if they're a conservative. I think that that's almost phase two. What we need to do is we need to make sure that people who agree with us on constitutional principles, people who agree with us on, again, a lot of foundational arguments on federalism and other things, we need to get people such as myself who lives in DC and knows a lot of, we need to expand this to get the like-minded onto this cause. So I think thinking about media channels in that respect, but also email lists. There's a lot of organizations, again, part of the decentralization and the challenges that this prevents, but there's a lot of groups around the country that, on many of which you're already working with, but they're also very impactful. There's everybody from Hillsdale College who advertise on Rush Limbaugh, who has constitutional scholars, to think tanks across the board. There's a lot of entities that help to promote these issues. So, that's really important too. So I hope that was an answer. I think it's all the above. The local media, though, I would never take the eye off the ball of the local media.
Yeah, one of the items that you said, make sure we set the record straight. Frank, we have a lot of NGOs that say whatever they want. And
Do they
how
ever?
would you best advise us to set that record straight, and how do we reach their audience?
It's a great question. So the question is setting the record straight from NGOs, and boy, is that true ever, right? NGOs, well, facts actually a lot of times have no bearing in what they do, right? So first, in 5 seconds or less, back to the wheel that we have here, NGOs actually have no interest a lot of times in the facts. They want to spiral the window. They want to raise money, right? I do a lot of issues. So part of the reason why they do a lot of what they did is they create an issue, send an email blast, say, contribute to our cause, right, and get favorable media. I would argue that before we actually start thinking about how to get to their audiences, because I would actually, and I'm a pretty optimistic communicator, which is I think there's a lot that you can change. The one thing that I don't think that you could change is changing the hearts and minds of those that are their true believers, because I think that they are, a lot of times, they've so bought into, right, the messages that are coming. They're donors, right? They know their donor list pretty well. I think what's most important, though, in what you asked is the correcting the record straight, because I don't believe that any ground. So let's just take environmental stewardship, for example. This notion that it's this false choice, right, between environmentalism and land management, right? So they have created this false choice. Fair? We have to seize that back. I bet you in this country there are a more dedicated group of environmentalists than those are in this room, right? So we actually have to seize that back. So I would say we pick our arguments, right? But this notion that somehow that they've created this box, I would take issue with the box. You are saying that I'm this, you're completely wrong. In fact, we actually live the land. We're the ones who, so I think and this could take we could have a lot of discussion about this, but I think picking your targets, and this is one that under no circumstances would I ever cede, right? And I would be very vocal and because again, that's how they work. Right, you're defending a negative, right? And I know that's hard and I know that's unpleasant, but that's the one that I think, because if we can make gradual changes in how, again, there's the reality and there's their reality. If we can make changes in making sure that people are not buying into their reality, your chances of policy outcomes that are favorable to you increase exponentially.
On Facebook, sometimes I'll get the editorial comments that'll come from these different news sources or the newspapers and whatnot. When I see one of those about the land and talking about how if the states do it, they're just going to take it away and build them all and all this other kind of nonsense, I write in there that it is a farce what you're saying. You build a straw man.
Yep.
This is not right, and we want to protect the environment as much as you do. We just want to be able to have public access to it for everyone.
Right.
And so you have to do that. You have to, anytime you see those, you have to make that kind of a comment.
It's a great point. So go ahead, will you finish? I don't mean to interrupt. It's a great comment. And I think maybe bridging that with the question in the back. So one of the things in politics a couple of years ago, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the argument about the Department of Education getting rid of the Federal Department of Education, right? So a couple of years ago, we did a lot of focus groups in the Republican Party about how this issue translated. And a lot of times people automatically, whether or not you agree with federal education or not, your mind automatically went to, well, what happens to the kids? Okay, so that's a great idea, but what happens to the kids? So what we learned is the most effective message about the Federal Department of Education is, I don't want a Federal Department of Education in Washington. I want one in our town. I want one on my block. I want one on my driveway, right? So I'm going to get to because I think you're right, but I think that the way to advance the environmental movement, especially from states, is, look, we're talking about we think we can do it better. And history and our own experience shows that we can, because guess what? The federal government isn't, right? So I think that you're right. And by the way, you have to correct those records, but I find it an indefensible position to say the status quo is acceptable. And I would back them up into that box. Now, the people that actually are persuadable, and by the way, a lot of this is rooted, right? Politics, if you have both sides, you're not going to move. It's everybody in the middle. One side, we're not going to move, right? But in the middle, and the people that are seeing your Facebook feeds need to understand that what we're not talking about is what the other folks are saying that we are. We're just saying we think we could do this better, cheaper, more effectively, right? In a better environmental stewards than the government has the resources, time, and energy to do.
Yeah, do you have any thoughts on how do we keep from eating our own? And we have a problem, I believe, with there are a lot of different industries that rely on public lands. That's what we're talking about here today. We're very like-minded, but I think the environmental community has been very successful at pitting us against each other on individual issues. And do you have any thoughts on how
That's a
do
great
we
question.
keep the bigger picture in mind and get the hunters to realize when you go after the livestock producers, you will be next?
It's a great question. It's there used to be a phase, paying the cannibals to eat you last. That's what happens when you start separating yourself, right? You're creating deals and you're going after one another. You have to have the big picture. By the way, I think that you're rooted in your question is the reality of what we're talking about, which is the environmental organizations have sort of a monolithic, right? We're decentralized, and then you have the hunters and the landowner. I mean, there's a lot. I would say the simple answer is don't take the bait, one, right? And we all have to, look, there's going to be stuff, policy disagreements we disagree with, situations in the news we disagree with, right? We're going to see extremes, including those that the fundamental causes we are ones we agree with. We may not like the tactics. We may not like but refuse the urge to be critical of those things. Because to the degree that we are, I think there's a difference between being critical and accepting, right? You know, and I think what we could say is, I think it's just very important for us to understand and to keep, and by the way, the dialogue between all those constituency groups needs to, you know, continue. It already does. But I think we just as individuals, and back to the don't have anything said that don't want attributed to you, that's how things actually get out of control, is when a movement starts getting pitted against one another. So I think that we really have to be mindful of making sure that we are not falling into the traps to the degree that there are differences, and making sure that we're keeping the big picture in mind. And basically also holding others to the same account. Good. Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Sorry I won't be joining you this afternoon. I have to catch a flight. But thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun.